My parents stole my life savings to fund my brother's disasters, told me I'd be repaid, and never gave me a single dollar back. Then they promised him my money again, this time for a house he'd already put in escrow, without asking me first. The look on my mother's face when I said no for the last time is something I will carry with me forever. Some things once seen cannot be unseen. I want to start with a number, because the number is the thing people always ask about first, and I think it is the least important part of this story. And I think understanding why it is the least important part is actually the whole point. The number is $31,000. That is how much my parents took from my savings account without telling me, without asking, without any conversation at all. Just a series of transfers on a Thursday afternoon in October while I was at work, executed with the casual efficiency of people who had considered the question of whether they had the right to do it, and had answered themselves without consulting the account holder. $31,000 is significant. Anyone who has tried to save money, really tried, with a real job and real expenses, and a real life that constantly presents reasons to spend rather than keep, understands what it costs to accumulate a number like that. It is not a fortune. But it is the kind of number that represents something beyond itself. A margin, a foundation, the physical evidence that your discipline has been real and that your future is something you have been actively building. It is the kind of money that, when it disappears without warning or consent, takes something else with it. Something harder to name and much harder to recover. I want to tell you the whole story, because the number is only the surface of it, and the surface is not where anything important actually lives. My brother Callum is 3 years older than me, which means he had 3 years to establish a pattern before I arrived to observe it, and by the time I was old enough to understand what I was seeing, the pattern was already the foundation. Callum was the golden child. I do not say that with bitterness exactly, or not only with bitterness. I say it because it is the plainest description of the family dynamic available, the one that would have been recognizable to any outside observer who spent more than 40 minutes with us. He was the firstborn, the son, the one my mother introduced first at every gathering and described longest when she was telling someone about her children. He was funny and loud and magnetic in the way some people are, the way that makes rooms easier and gatherings more lively, and everyone around him feel like something good is about to happen. I loved him, for most of my childhood, with the uncomplicated love of a younger sibling who has not yet been given enough reasons to complicate it. The first time I understood there was a system operating in my family that I was not a full participant in, I was 13 years old. My parents had told both of us over several years of discussion that they were putting money aside for each of us for college. A dedicated account, they said, contributions from relatives at birthdays and Christmases, their own contributions when they could manage it, equal amounts for each, a promise that felt like bedrock. When I was 13 and Callum was 16, he wrecked his bicycle, not his fault. A car ran alight and needed surgery on his shoulder. The surgery was covered by insurance. The physical therapy that followed was partially covered. The gap was several $100s a month for about 5 months. My parents paid it, which was the right thing to do. But they paid it from the college fund, specifically from the portion they had designated as shared between us without telling either of us. I found out at 18 when I sat down with my father to go over the college fund, and discovered it was significantly smaller than I had been told. When I asked about the discrepancy, he explained about the physical therapy. When I asked why Callum's portion hadn't been reduced rather than the shared portion, he looked at me with an expression I was too young to name, but that I now understand as the face of a person who genuinely had not considered the question. It had not occurred to him that this was a question. I want to stay with that for a moment, because I think it is the key to everything that followed. The decisions that shaped my family's financial life were not made out of cruelty. My mother, Sandra, is not a cruel woman. My father, Robert, is not a mean man. They are people who at some point in the early years of raising children made an unconscious determination about which child needed protecting and which child could be relied on to be okay. And then they organized their lives around that determination, so thoroughly and so consistently that it stopped being a choice and became simply the way things were. They were not bad parents. They were parents who had decided, without examining the decision, that one of their children was more fragile than the other, and that the fragile one required more of everything. Callum was the fragile one, I was the one who would be okay. The problem is not the conclusion. Children are different, and families do make accommodations for those differences, And there is nothing inherently wrong with recognizing that one child needs more support than another. The problem is when the accommodation is never re-examined, when it calcifies from a response to a specific need into a permanent operating principle, when the OK child begins to fund the fragile one without anyone naming it or asking whether it is fair. I did not name it for a long time. I built workarounds instead. At 16, I got my first job, a weekend shift at a bakery that paid me enough over about 2 years to save up for my own laptop when the family computer was perpetually occupied by Callum's gaming. At 18, I took out the maximum available in student loans and found a work-study position and graduated from college with debt I had mostly managed myself, while Callum's college expenses, which ran longer and came with a graduate program my parents contributed to generously, were funded through a combination of the college account and additional contributions that I was never told the total of. At 22, I got a job at an accounting firm and rented a room in a shared house because I could not afford an apartment, and I made a decision that year that I have thought about many times since. I would save aggressively, I would track every dollar, and I would build the foundation that my family had not built for me. Over the next 8 years I did exactly that. I was not austere to the point of misery. I had a life, I had friends, I spent money on things that mattered to me. But I did not take vacations I couldn't afford. I drove a car that was 12 years old and reliable. I cooked most of my own meals. I negotiated raises and took on extra projects and said yes to the boring assignments that other people turned down. I contributed to my retirement account from my first paycheck, and I increased the contribution with every raise. And every month without fail, I moved a fixed amount into a savings account, a high-yield account, because I work in finance and I know the difference between keeping money and growing it, and I watched the balance climb. By the time I was 30, the savings account had $47,000 in it. There is also something I should tell you about that savings account, something I have told the people closest to me with the specific embarrassment of a person admitting a mistake they should have caught earlier. When I first opened the account, I was 22 and still in the habit of operating within the family's financial structure. My parents were on the account. It had been opened as a joint account because at the time, young, early in my career, still fundamentally trusting of the people who had raised me, it had seemed sensible. In case of emergency. In case I needed them to access it quickly. It was a convenience that I had meant to revisit and never had, because there was always something more pressing, and because some part of me was still holding on to the belief that the family I had decided to trust was worthy of that trust. I moved to remove them from the account when I was 28. I had the form. I had set a reminder. The reminder came and went, and I was in the middle of a complicated quarter at work, and I filed it under next month and forgot about it, the way you forget about things that feel like administrative tasks when life is asking more of you than it usually does. 2 years later, on a Thursday in October, my parents used their access to transfer $31,000 from my savings account to an account I had never heard of. They told me 4 days later. I want to describe that phone call with precision, because the way it was delivered matters to the story almost as much as what was delivered. My mother called on a Monday evening. She and I spoke every week or so, not with great intimacy, but with the regularity of people maintaining a relationship that requires some upkeep. The call started normally. She asked about work, about my apartment, about David, who I had been with for 3 years at that point, and who she had mostly accepted in the way she accepted most of my choices. With the mild approval of someone who has determined that the choice is unlikely to require her intervention. About 10 minutes in, she said, and I remember this phrasing exactly, because I have replayed it more times than I can count. I wanted to let you know that we've had to make some adjustments to the savings account. I asked her what she meant. She explained. Callum had gotten himself into some financial trouble, credit card debt from 2 years of overspending, a failed attempt at a car dealership that had left him owing money to several people, and some additional obligations she was vague about in a way that, at the time, I didn't press on, but that I later understood to mean there were people involved that she didn't want to name. The total of Callum's obligations had been significant. She and my father had looked at the options and determined that the fastest way to address it was to use the savings account. She said the savings account, as if it belonged to everyone equally. She said we've had to make some adjustments, as if adjustments were things that happened to accounts rather than decisions that people made. She said all of it in the tone she uses when she is delivering information she has already processed and moved past, and is now offering to me as a finished fact rather than something still open for discussion. I said, "Mom, how much did you take?" She said, 31,000, but it's temporary, we're going to pay it back as soon as things settle. I sat in my apartment with the phone in my hand and looked at the wall. David was in the other room. I could hear him making dinner, the specific domestic sounds of a person who has no idea that the world has just shifted. I want to tell you what I felt, because I think feelings are data, and I think how we process them tells us something about who we are. What I felt was not primarily anger. What I felt first was a kind of vertigo, the feeling of the floor being somewhere other than where you put your foot. I had known, in some constructed and unexamined way, that my family's relationship to my resources was different from their relationship to Callum's. But knowing something conceptually and confronting it as an executed financial transaction are different kinds of knowledge, and the confrontation version arrived with a force I had not been prepared for. The anger came second, and it was real and it was large and it did not go away. I told my mother that she should not have done that. She said she understood it was surprising, but that it was an emergency, and that they hadn't had time to consult me. I told her that an emergency was not a reason to take money from someone's account without asking, and that the time required to make a phone call was significantly less than the time required to execute a wire transfer, and that I needed her to explain to me specifically when and how the money would be returned. She said she wasn't sure of a timeline, but that they would figure it out. Figure it out was the last thing my mother said to me on the subject that I found remotely adequate as a response to the situation. Over the following weeks she transitioned to a series of framings that I catalogued internally as I received them. The money was essentially a loan to the family, which the family would repay. The money had served an important purpose, and I should focus on that. Callum had been in a genuinely desperate situation, and family comes first. I had more than enough in the account before the withdrawal, and I was clearly doing well financially, so the impact was less for me than it would have been for others. That last one, that I was clearly doing well so the loss was smaller, is the one I have thought about most often in the years since. It contains in compressed form the entire logic of the favoritism I grew up inside of, because I had built something the taking from it was more acceptable. Because I was okay, the cost of making me less okay was lower. Because I was the one who would be fine, I was the one who could afford to absorb the impact of everyone else's emergencies. I removed my parents from the savings account the week after that phone call. I called the bank, waited on hold for 40 minutes, and completed the process that I should have completed 2 years earlier. The person on the phone was professional and kind, and did not know that the conversation they were having with me was one of the most important ones of that year. I also began to accept, in the slow and non-linear way that real acceptance works, that the $31,000 was not coming back. Not because my parents were planning to keep it. I believe they genuinely intended to return it. In the same way I believe people who miss loan payments genuinely intend to catch up. But intention is not the same as capacity, and the capacity for my parents to accumulate $31,000 in savings when their financial life had been organized for years around the ongoing support of my brother's recurring crises was not something I could identify when I looked at their situation with clear eyes. They did not have it to give back. They had already spent it on the next thing before the first thing was resolved. 4 years passed. I rebuilt the savings account. I was angry for a long time, and then I was less angry, and then I arrived at something that is not quite forgiveness, but is also not active bitterness. A kind of clear-eyed distance from the situation that allowed me to participate in the family without carrying the weight of the expectation that anything would be different. David knew everything. Kezia, my best friend since our early 20s, knew everything. My Aunt Ruth, my father's sister, a woman who had spent 40 years watching my parents operate and had her own particular and very accurate view of the architecture, knew most of it. The people I trusted had the full picture, and with them I could be honest about what had happened. With my parents and Callum, I operated in a different register, civil, present, carefully boundaried. It was not a comfortable arrangement, but it was one I could sustain. Until the dinner. The dinner was at my parents' house on a Sunday in March. Callum had been doing better, by the standards the family applied to Callum. He had a new position at a company run by a friend of his, a small outfit in the logistics sector that I didn't know much about but that seemed to be providing him with a salary, and more importantly, a sense of forward motion that had been largely absent from his life for the previous decade. He had been with a woman named Amber for about 18 months, and Amber was pleasant, genuinely warm and interested and communicative in ways that Callum had not always chosen in partners. He seemed, if not settled, then on the way to it. And I had allowed myself, cautiously and with full awareness of my own caution, to feel something like hope about it. My parents invited us both for dinner with the specific cheerful vagueness of a phone call that contains more information than it's releasing. My mother said it was just dinner with the energy of someone who has a presentation prepared. I noted the energy and mentioned it to David when I hung up. He said, "Do you want me to come?" I told him it was just dinner. He gave me the look he gives me when he disagrees but respects my judgment. I drove to my parents' house alone. The dinner was good, my mother is an excellent cook, and this part has never been a source of complaint. Callum and Amber were already there when I arrived, and the table was set with the good dishes, which was the second signal that this was not, in fact, just dinner. We ate and talked about the usual things for about an hour. My mother kept refilling everyone's wine with the generosity of a host who wants the room in a particular mood before the presentation begins. The presentation began over dessert. My father, who is quieter than my mother and typically speaks in these family conversations as a secondary voice confirming what she has already said, cleared his throat and said he wanted to talk about something exciting. My mother was already smiling the smile she uses when something has been decided, and she is ready to share it. Callum looked at the table for a moment, and Amber looked at my parents. And I felt the specific physical sensation, something in my sternum, a tightening that I have learned to associate with conversations that are going to cost me something. Callum and Amber were buying a house. This part was presented as news, as an announcement, as the occasion for the good dishes and the wine refills. And I was happy, genuinely, provisionally, because a house meant commitment, a plan, a future being taken seriously. I said congratulations and I meant it. Then my mother said, "We've been talking about how we want to help, and your father and I are going to contribute what we can. And we told Callum and Amber that you'd be able to put in $20,000 toward the down payment." The table was quiet for a moment. Not dramatically quiet, no one had said anything shocking yet, or rather, everyone at the table except me seemed to understand that nothing shocking had been said. I put my fork down. I said, "You told them I'd contribute $20,000. My mother said, "We thought it would be a lovely way for the family to come together for something positive." I said, without asking me first. My mother said that she had assumed I would want to support my brother, that it wasn't a large amount given my financial situation, that she and my father had been talking about it for weeks, and it had just seemed like the natural thing to do. Natural. I want to sit in that word for a moment, because I think it reveals something important. What my mother meant by natural was that she had applied the family's operating logic and arrived at the same conclusion it always arrived at, that my resources were available to Callum when he needed them, because I was the one who would be okay. She was not attempting to manipulate me. She was not being malicious. She was applying a system she had been running for 30 years and had never once been asked to examine. And in that system, the natural outcome of a family member needing money was that I provided it. The fact that this family member had access to money partly because I had rebuilt the savings account they had drained 4 years earlier was not part of the calculation. Or rather, and this is the most honest way I know to say it, it was part of the calculation in the wrong direction. The successful rebuild was evidence that I was doing fine, and doing fine meant I could absorb the next ask. I told my mother that I was not going to contribute $20,000 to the down payment. I said it calmly and without elaboration, because I had learned over the years that elaboration in these conversations serves as material for counter-arguments, and I was not interested in a counter-argument. Callum said, "Are you serious?" I told him I was serious. He said, "We've already signed the paperwork." I said, "I understand. That was a decision you made before you confirmed the source of funding. That's not my responsibility." My mother's expression shifted, not to anger, that came later. First to something more hurt and more complicated, the expression of a person who has drawn a family map and is discovering that one of the lines doesn't connect where they thought it did. Amber said nothing, very carefully, which was the correct and polite thing to do and which I appreciated even then. My father said, "We hoped you'd want to be part of this." I told him I understood. I told them all, as clearly and as calmly as I was capable of managing in that moment, that my answer was no, and that my answer was no specifically because I was still waiting 4 years later, for the return of the $31,000 they had taken from me without asking, and that giving another $20,000 on top of that amount would bring the total of my contributions to this family's financial well-being to over $50,000, which was a number I was not willing to arrive at without anyone having asked whether I agreed to it. I said the number 51,000, and it landed in the room the way numbers land when they have been avoided for a long time. Heavy, specific, harder to dismiss than feelings. My mother said I was being selfish. I said I was going home. I drove home. I called David from the parking lot, which is what I do when something has happened that I need to say out loud before I can think about it clearly. He answered on the second ring and listened without interrupting for 4 minutes, and when I was done he said, "Okay, come home, we'll figure out what comes next." David works in corporate finance. He is, by both training and temperament, a person who looks at numbers the way other people look at X-rays, not to be dramatic about what they reveal, but to understand what is actually there. In the week after the dinner, while I was processing the conversation and my family was generating a considerable volume of phone calls and text messages that I was managing at arm's length, David quietly looked into the logistics company where Callum worked. He came to me on a Wednesday evening with a specific expression, not the look he gets when he has found something dramatic, but the look he gets when the numbers don't make sense, and he has checked them enough times to be certain. He told me that the logistics company had been incorporated 14 months ago, that the principal officer of the company was a man named Greg who had been a close friend of Callum's since they were 25, that the company had filed one set of financial statements since incorporation, and that the revenue figures were modest, significantly lower than would be implied by the salary Callum had described to the family. That the position Callum held, Vice President of Business Development, was one of 3 listed executive roles, all of whom were the company's only employees. He also told me that the house in escrow was listed at $460,000, that the down payment requirement was somewhere between $46,000 and $60,000, depending on the mortgage terms they had qualified for, and that my parents had in the previous month taken out a home equity loan against their own property, the house they had lived in for 30 years, for $35,000. The family's plan for funding Callum's house was $35,000 from my parents' home equity, $20,000 from me, and whatever Callum and Amber had managed to save, which David estimated based on their described incomes and a reasonable savings rate, was not $20,000. The entire structure depended on my $20,000. Without it, the down payment didn't exist. Without the down payment, the house didn't close. And my parents had taken out a loan against their home, the primary asset of 2 people in their mid-60s with limited retirement savings, to fund a portion of a transaction that required my participation to work. I sat with this information for a long time. Then I called Aunt Ruth. Aunt Ruth has watched my family from a particular vantage point for decades. She is my father's younger sister, and she has the distinct quality of someone who has chosen, over many years and many occasions, to love a family without colluding with its patterns. She does not participate in the consensus that Callum is fragile and I am fine. She does not redistribute around me in the way my parents do. She has always, in the quiet ways available to an aunt who visits 4 times a year and calls on birthdays, made it clear to me that she sees me, not as the resilient one, not as the reliable one, but as myself, with my own needs and my own costs and my own story. I called her and told her everything. The dinner, the $20,000, the home equity loan, the logistics company, the 4 years of waiting for the $31,000 that was never going to come back. She listened for a long time without speaking. Then she said, "I've been watching your parents do this for 30 years. The only thing that's changed is the amount." She told me things I hadn't known. That the pattern with Callum had started when he was very young, younger than I had realized, and that it was connected to something that had happened with him medically when he was 4, before I was born, that had frightened my parents enormously and had, without either of them ever articulating it or deciding it consciously, organized the rest of their parenting around the ongoing management of that fear. She said it carefully, not as an excuse. I'm not saying it justifies anything, I'm saying it explains the origin, and I received it the same way. An explanation, not an absolution. She also said, "You know the house is going to collapse regardless, right?" I asked her what she meant. She said, "Even if you give them the $20,000, The mortgage payment on a $460,000 house is not sustainable on what Callum actually earns. This is a house built on a fiction. The question is just how long the fiction runs before it ends. I already knew this, but hearing someone else say it, someone who had watched the family long enough to have pattern recognition, was a different kind of knowing. I told her I wasn't giving them the money. She said, "Good." My mother's campaign began the week after the dinner and had several phases that I will describe with the dispassion they deserve, because I think there is something useful in understanding how these campaigns work, how the people who run them are not malicious, but are genuinely convinced of the narrative they are constructing. Phase 1 was direct appeal. Phone calls, several per day for the first 3 days, making the case from different angles. Family solidarity, Callum's progress, the significance of the opportunity, the relatively small size of the ask in the context of my financial situation, the hurt that my refusal was causing. I answered the first 2 calls and gave the same answer each time. After that I let them go to voicemail and responded by text with a single sentence. My answer hasn't changed. Phase 2 was third-party deployment. I received calls from 2 cousins I speak to infrequently, each of whom had been given a version of the situation that I would describe as aggressively edited. The version they had been given emphasized the house, Callum's progress and the family's hope for unity, and did not include the $31,000, the home equity loan, or the fact that my contribution had been promised without my knowledge. I spoke to both cousins long enough to give them the real version, and both conversations ended in the specific silence of people recalibrating. Phase 3 was my father, who called on a Thursday night and who was different from my mother in a way that was, honestly, harder to handle. Where my mother was persistent and certain, my father was quiet and sad. He said he was sorry about the savings account. He said it with the weight of someone who has been carrying something for a long time and is putting it down in the wrong place, too late to fix anything. He said it didn't excuse anything. He said he hoped I knew that. I told him I knew. I told him that knowing didn't change my answer. He said, "I just don't know what's going to happen to him." I said, "Dad, that can't be my job. It has never been my job, even when everyone acted like it was." He was quiet for a very long time. Then he said good night and we hung up, and I sat with the sadness of a daughter who loves her father and is running out of ways to protect that love from the cost of what he asks it to absorb. The campaign ended without resolution, not because my mother gave up. She is not a person who gives up easily, but because there came a point at which the house itself collapsed the urgency. The escrow fell through. Without a down payment that added up to the required amount, the purchase didn't close. Callum and Amber did not buy the house. Amber ended the relationship about 2 months later. I do not know the details of what she said to him, because I was not in the room, but I know from Callum's version of events, delivered to the family in a phone call full of anger and grief, that the house had been a significant part of what she had been building her future around, and that its loss had revealed things about Callum's financial situation and prospects that she had not fully understood before the escrow process required them to be documented. He was devastated. I want to be honest about that. He was genuinely, deeply devastated, and some part of me felt it with him, because I am not without compassion for my brother, who has spent his whole life having consequences removed from his path, only to be ambushed by them later in larger forms. That is its own kind of tragedy. It is not my tragedy to solve, but I see it. My parents' home equity loan remains. They are servicing it on a fixed income with the specific quiet difficulty of people who have made a decision they cannot undo, and are managing the aftermath with more dignity than the original decision deserved. I have not offered to help them pay it. I have examined that choice many times, and concluded that helping them pay the cost of a plan that required my participation to succeed. A plan made without my knowledge, funded in part by my past contributions without my consent, would be a continuation of the same system I have been trying to exit. I am not certain I am right, but I am certain I am done operating within a system that was never designed to account for my interests. There is something I have thought about extensively in the years since the dinner, and I want to tell you about it because I think it is the most honest part of the story. After everything settled, after the house, after Amber, after my mother's campaign ended in exhausted silence and my father's sad phone calls became less frequent, I found myself in a strange position. I had done the right thing, or what I was nearly certain was the right thing, and the result was not relief. It was a kind of grief I had not anticipated, the grief of having finally, formally, stopped pretending. I had spent most of my life managing my relationship with my family through a combination of distance and generosity. The distance kept me safe. The generosity, the savings account, the tolerance, the endless extending